In today's video I'll show you something really special, the biggest project I've ever attempted and poured all my mini painting knowledge into. An Ork Diorama set on the Imperial Hive planet of Armageddon, starring the only ork who is both strong and smart, the prophet of Gork and Mork, the one and only Ghazghkull Thraka, and of course his trusty sidekick Makari, the lucky grot. And of course every diorama featuring orks is obviously the best, so here we go boys, let's see how I did it. Hey guys, I'm Zoltan and you're watching Fallon's Miniatures. A short while ago I made my very first diorama for a competition and I made a video about it on the channel, so if you haven't seen it yet, I'll link it in the video description. I was working under huge time pressure and only had a few days to complete it before the deadline, plus many of the techniques I used there I actually used for the first time, but it was a huge learning experience and I enjoyed it immensely. As you can probably tell from the channel, I love painting minis, a lot. But this was on a whole new level. This made me fall in love with the hobby all over again. So the logical next step was to do another one, but this time I wanted to place it in the Warhammer 40k universe. The question was, what should be the topic of the diorama? There are so many options in 40k for epic scenes that it can be a bit overwhelming. But fortunately for me, it was the month of Orktober, so the heroes of the story were basically a given. And every git knows that if you want to do a big ork diorama, you should include the biggest ork there is. Fortunately for me, I already had him built, but not painted, for ages, so this was the perfect opportunity to give him the proper paint job he deserves. Now I just needed to know at what point of his illustrious career I should depict him. So I went to Kindle and downloaded Ghazghkull Thraka, Prophet of the Wa by Nate Crowley to learn more about our hero. It's one of the best and most hilarious 40k books I've ever read. If you don't like orks, in which case, what's wrong with you? After reading this, you will definitely want to collect orks. I finished the book almost in a single sitting, and by the end I knew what I had to do. I needed to show what happened after. Ghazghkull might have lost his head, literally, for a little while, but now he would show the beaky doggy boys who is boss. So the first order of business was to figure out what pieces I needed and how to arrange them on the base and to prepare everything for the painting process. Fortunately, back when I built Ghaz, I was smart enough to not fully glue him together, which allowed me to have his head and battle jaws separate, so I pinned those individually to make the painting a little bit easier. Ghaz is a pretty big lad, so painting him will be difficult enough without trying to reach the head inside the jaw while holding the huge body. Unfortunately, he was already glued to the base and also to his own scenic base, so that made things a bit more difficult, but as you will see later, this was solved by a happy accident. I went through my bits box and some half-built kits to find some unfortunate space marines who could be done in by Ghazghkull and the boys. I found one of my earliest half-finished attempts to build and paint a Space Marine, and I thought that would be a great opportunity for him to finally get a proper paint job. He would be kinda dead and defeated, but you can't have everything, right? I added another Hellblaster body and selected a few head, arm and weapon options to choose from later. The goal was to make them look like they are actually lying there limply and not like a robot. If I just laid them down in their normal standing poses, they would have looked like they glitched out in a video game, so I definitely needed to repose them a bit before painting. Normally I would build a whole diorama first before starting the painting process, but since Ghaz was attached to his scenic base, I decided to paint him first and then build a diorama around him. So let's see how I painted the big boss and his sidekick, and then we will come back to the base right after. Ghazghkull's head is probably one of the most important elements on the model. People tend to look at the model's face in general, but this time it's even more important since that is the only actual visible green orc part on here. And since we all know that green is best, the face had to be done properly. If I walked you through every step of the painting process, this video would be several hours long, but if you want to know all the details, head over to my Patreon where I will have long-form videos and written guides about every element in this project. Suffice it to say that I started from a red underpainting and highlighted up with greens, mixing in more and more yellows as I went up in highlights and finished in a bright yellow for the final highlight. I painted in the gums and the tongue with magenta and then started working on the teeth, which of course are very important for greenskins. They can be too white since that would be weird for an orc, so I used my favorite recipe of Ragnar's hide, Zentry dust to sharp the bone and a little Mournfang brown to give them that nice healthy color orcs love so much. Later I will use the same colors on the big bone, horns and skulls on the main body as well. Of course I had to paint in the stitches too, where his head was reattached after Ragnar Blackmane cut it off, but we will show him and his beaky runs who is boss by the time this diorama is finished. Then came the plate on Ghazghkull's head that covers the part with half of his brain missing and which was salvaged from the rear end of a big Hume Terminator. Seriously, read the book, it's awesome. I intended to have quite a bit of bronze on this model, so while it's not entirely lore accurate, I thought it would fit the scheme I was going for better, so why not? To finish off the metals, I added in the steel elements with some dark sea blue. Both of these color choices were quite important, since later I would use the same colors to paint the metals all around the diorama to tie everything together. Finally, I painted in Ghazghkull's piercing red gaze, both in his real and his mechanical eye. Since I already had all the right colors on my wet palette, I decided to paint Makari the immortal grot at this point as well. Painting the body was quite straightforward, since I could use the exact same method I used on the head as well. But the banner is a different matter. In some ways, the banner is a more important part of Makari than his body, since the current incarnation of Makari can die, but the banner always stays the same, so it had to be done right. Aside from the lore consideration, it was also important for two more reasons. First of all, I planned to place Makari under Ghazghkull and closer to the viewer, so the banner would not overlap and obscure the main model. But this meant that it would be quite front and center on the diorama, so it had to match the quality I intended for Ghazghkull himself. The other reason is that it has a ton of different colors and materials on it that I also wanted to have on the main body, and the two needed to match visually. So my choices here will reflect how the whole piece would look like. The bronze and the steel I have already established on the head, but here I had a chance to try them out on bigger surfaces. But the reds and the whites were new, and I had to find the right color choices for them. For the white, I painted everything in a very bright silver color, used Seraphim sepia over the whole surface, and then I painted back most of it with the same grey with a little white mixed in. I liked this weathered look so much that I later added a large white armor panel on Ghaz's body with the same colors to break up the monotonous black armor. For the reds, I was debating whether I should go with more desaturated highlights by adding white, or I should lean towards oranges. In the end, I went with orange because you know me, when I can add more color, I will. To make it more interesting, I glazed some dark sea blue towards the end of the banner. This part will stick out from the base, and having it darker will direct the attention inward where the colors are, at least that's what I hoped. I also added some transfers on the banner to make it look more interesting and even more like the box art. We are almost at the main body now, but there was one more important piece first that helped me establish some of the remaining color choices. What would be an orc warboss without his battle jaw, right? I started painting the jaw by creating the characteristic orky checkered pattern first. This is important because the jaw is very much in the center of attention, almost as much as the face. But also because there will be two more checkered patterns on the main body, so this was a good way to establish the method. After I painted the whole surface with the same light grey I used on the banner, I freehanded the checkered pattern with black, going back and forth a couple of times, correcting mistakes and making sure it is more or less straight. I painted the reds and the metals the same way as on the banner, even making some adjustments to make them look even better. Then I added some battle damage with scratches to the white and washed the whole surface, including the black parts, in Seraphim sepia. Finally, I highlighted the black with some grey colors. I will use the same method of Seraphim sepia wash and grey highlights on the main body as well. Alright, now it was time to tackle the huge armored body of Ghazghkull himself, but now that I established most of the important color choices, it felt a little bit less daunting. I started by painting the whites and the checkered pattern first. Don't ask me why, I wanted to just get stuck in there somewhere, and this seemed as good a place as any. I used the same method that I already tried and tested on the banner, but this time I left it halfway finished after the wash stage. I was afraid that I would mess it up with some other colors later, and if I did, it would be easier to fix while it was not highlighted. I felt that the bare white is a little too plain though, considering that the other shoulder had the nice checkered pattern, so I added a cool transfer. A red one, of course, because orcs. Normally I would paint things one element at a time, but this model was so huge that I decided to make my life a bit easier by painting in some of the base coats to help me see what is what. All the grey metals got a thin layer of dark sea blue as their base coat to differentiate them from everything else around them, and all the bronze and red parts got a base coat with a dark red mix. I have to admit that at this point I was still quite intimidated by how big this model was and how many things I had to paint. I could lie and say that I decided to tackle it by painting it bit by bit, but in reality I was simply afraid to start painting the more important elements. So I did the obvious thing and I painted the pants with some boring browns, and just to find something else that is relatively small and straightforward, next I painted his loincloth red. But then it was time to face the music and paint the scary stuff, like the black armor and the bronze and steel metal surfaces. I started by doing some thick edge highlights on all the black elements with dark sea blue, and yes, some of you cheeky gits might have noticed that this is the same color I used on the metals as well, but that is actually intentional. You will see me using a lot of dark sea blue all around this piece to tie things together. Then I used my tried and true Seraphim sepia and I painted it on all the black surfaces. This will make them look more beaten up, and it will also give them a little glossiness to separate them from the rest of the surfaces. After this I added the same highlights I used on the jaw as well, first with silver grey and then with iron hue, painting in all the edges and also adding some wear and tear with some scratches here and there. Finally, I used some orangish brown colors to add some rust effect to the armor around the rivets and some of the tears in the armor. So the black was pretty straightforward. I just followed the same steps I had already established earlier, but on a much larger surface. The bronze was a little more tricky though. Well, most of it was actually fine. I used the same recipe that I already did on the banner, building it up from reds and oranges all the way up to a bright yellow tone with some dark sea blue glazes in the shadows. But the claw was a little bit of a problem. One could argue that the claw is as important on this model as Ghazghkull's face, since nobody can resist looking at a nice big chopper, and he certainly has a big one. So obviously I wanted to do a fancy paint job on it with two different colors. A rusty or bronze looking metal on the upper not choppy side that is different from the rest of the bronze on the model, and the shiny steel-like cutting edge. In the beginning, I even had a glow effect planned, as if an explosion was happening right next to it. The problem was that I just couldn't get it right. The bronze didn't look good, and the yellow light effect didn't match the rest of the model. But any orc knows that if you are defeated once, you just have to get up and get stuck in again until you win. So I simply repainted it and tried again, this time adding a red glaze in the metal where the red parts of the claw would reflect on it, and some dark sea blue where the armor of the Space Marines on the ground would cause a reflection. And this time I actually liked it. Later I would add some more glazes to make it match the rest of the elements more, but it was good enough for now. Since I already foreshadowed the reds with the glazes on the claw, I painted that next, using the same reds to oranges and yellows approach as before. On the back side of the claw I created the familiar checkered pattern, but this time with the red instead of white. I made it look like it's fading out towards the bottom by glazing some thin down black over it a few times. I also painted all the cables going from his power plant to the claw and the huge shooter on the right arm. Now that I'd worked myself up to a proper mindset with the bronze, it was time to deal with the most difficult part of this model, all the steel metal bits. And there are a lot of those all around the model, including half of the backside. Now this model took a long time for me to paint. You can try to guess how long in the comments. I am kinda curious what your estimates are, but painting the steel ate up almost 1/3 of the overall time I spent on the diorama. I will probably have an entire video about it on Patreon, but it went something like this. I started on the claw first, creating multiple highlights on all the cutting edges with scratches, mostly following the sculpted details and adding a little red glaze in the shadows. Then I extended the same colors on all the other metal elements as well, but I paid attention to not push the brightness as much and keep the claw the brightest thing on the model. I highlighted everything 7 or 8 times with progressively brighter and brighter colors. First, I did the highlighting by adding more and more white to dark sea blue, then I sped things up a little by adding a red shadow color with the airbrush. After that I switched to light greys and ivory, and in the end to white for the final highlights. And as usual I did the whole thing with my usual sketchy method that I talked about in the last video on the channel. Check that out if you want to know more about it. And as always, all the metals also needed a little extra twist to make them more interesting, so on the steel I added the same rust effect that I already used on the black panels, and on the bronze I did a verdigris effect instead with some blue-greens. We are in the home stretch now with the most tricky parts done. I only needed to do the bones and a couple of details here and there. And for the bones I had my tried and true method of Rhinox hide, Zendri dust to Shabti bone and Mornfang brown, making a nice transition from almost pure black to almost white, with a little orangish color in the middle to make them interesting. Now I just had to put the big boy together to see what I accomplished. I encountered a couple of problems though. First, I realized that the lamps inside the jaw are much more visible than I thought, and their light should reflect on the face. No worries, that was an easy fix. Then I tried to slot the jaw into the body and it just wouldn't fit at first. Of course, I was a stupid kid because I wasn't pushing it in the right angle, but I didn't realize it at first, so being in the orky mood, I thought applying more force would solve everything. And that is when the whole body of Ghaz just broke off the base and toppled from the painting handle. Fortunately, he is built like a Lehman Russ battle tank, so he suffered no injuries, but this actually solved my problem with the base. Now I could build a diorama with the scenic base included and not worry about messing up the paint job on the boss. Alright, let's forget about that little incident, it never happened. At this point Ghazghkull and Makari were finished, so it was time to go back to the base. I had to figure out how to build up the terrain on the base in a way that Ghaz would tower over the battlefield with the dead humies defeated at his feet and Makari standing triumphant over them with the banner sticking out to the side. First, I needed something to build up the volume of the terrain, and I didn't want to use milliput or green stuff for it since that felt a little excessive. Instead, I turned to aluminum foil. This stuff has served me well in the past and it did its job again. It's cheap and it's always available. When I had the general shape down with the aluminum foil, I coated the whole thing in some milliput to hold it together and to give everything a nice and solid foundation. This stuff dries as hard as stone and it sticks to everything. When I had everything covered, I started adding the Space Marines. I wanted to have one guy lying on his back in a way that Makari can rest his foot on his head. The other one I wanted to have on his belly right under the claw, as if he tried his final charge up the hill but was cut down before he made it. As I mentioned in the beginning, the most difficult thing was to make them look like they are actually just lying there. Normally these guys are in standing poses, and that doesn't look anything close to natural when you try to have them lie down. So I needed to do a little creative cutting and tearing them limb from limb to make it look good, but I made it happen. But there was one more thing I wanted to add. While I was painting the models, I realized that my scene lacked a little bit of orky flavor. Orcs winning and killing beaky humies is all well and good, but where was the fun? A nice wah and a little humor goes together like the face of a grot and an orc's fist, so I had to fix that. And the solution was simple. A squig makes everything better. So I rummaged among my half-painted projects a little and again found this nice handsome squig that I half-finished at some point in the past. I had to fill in some gaps and repaint the whole thing to fit the scene better, but I only needed to give him the tone of arm of one of the Space Marines, and I had the perfect little comic relief and a nice balance for the scene on the right side. Before I finished, I needed to add one more fun element. First, I cut a hole in the side of the Space Marine lying on his back. When the hole was large enough, I stuck a nice big chopper in there for good measure and to show that the boys also did their part. Now I just had to coat the whole base with a terrain paste to give it texture, and with that it was ready to be primed and painted. I gave it a coat of black primer and then a dark red zenithal from above to establish the atmosphere. The planet Armageddon is supposed to be a wasteland, so that was the look I was going for. I dry brushed some progressively lighter browns first and then added some color and shading back by shooting a glaze of full red in the shadows with the airbrush. The fact that dry brushing creates a dusty look actually helped me here. Originally I wanted to add some pigment powders, but after seeing the results of the dry brushing I realized that I didn't actually need it. Now I just had to paint the dead humies and the things on Ghazghkull's scenic base. Normally I would make the base a little less detailed than the model on it, but not this time. This time I wanted to go all out. That meant that the Space Marines got the full treatment with the proper Space Wolves color scheme. I base coated both the grey and the yellow bits by brush first, and then I took the airbrush again and sprayed on the first highlights. To be honest, I might have lost more than I gained with this move since I oversprayed a little, which needed to be fixed, but at least I established some nice highlights, I guess. I added some transfers to make it obvious that these were Ragnar's runs, if it wasn't super obvious from the greyish blue and yellow color scheme and the fact that they got a good beating from the boys. Then I shaded all the recesses of the armor with whole red instead of the usual black to make them fit better into the environment, and finished the armor with 3 rounds of highlights. I painted in all the other elements like the gold aquila on the chest, the red eye lenses, the black casings on the weapons, leather weapon holsters and belts, and the metal bits including the non-metallic metal on the chopper. I even painted a decent face on the guy facing away from the main view, including a nice 6 o'clock shadow. In the end I added even more transfers because why not, and of course a little blood effect is always needed. And with that it was time to peel off the tape from around the base and glue the models down so I can finally see what I have been working on for so long. And with everything in place, the end result looks like this. This has been the biggest and at the same time the most fun painting project I have ever attempted, and I think it also shows my current best when it comes to painting. But let me know what you guys think. Do you think I did the biggest orc there is justice? And do you want to see more dioramas like this on the channel? In the meantime, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe. And if you want to have a more in-depth look at what I did here and what paints I use, check out my Patreon, where I will be posting the written and video guides in the next few weeks, starting with the first one today. Thanks a lot for watching and for your support, especially to my Patreons. See you in the next one.